Hello, and welcome to the Buddhist Studies podcast. I'm here today with my guest, Dr. Daniel M. Stewart, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of South Carolina. He received an MA and PhD in Buddhist Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. And he has a broad interest in traditions of contemplative practice in South Asia, but also in the global present. And he'll be teaching our second course at Buddhist Studies Online, Buddhist Studies Online 102, Buddhist Meditation in Theory and Practice. So welcome, Daniel.
Thank you for having me, Kate.
Yes, I'm really excited to talk with you today and give students the opportunity to get to know you a little bit better, both in terms of your research interests and then what you'll be teaching in BSO 102. So maybe we can start by asking, how did you come to study Buddhism in the first place?
Well, yeah, it's a bit of a long story, but we can maybe make it quite short. Basically, as a young man in high school, I was pretty depressed and generally kind of angsty like many of us. And one of the sort of resources I found as a young man at that time to think through some of my, relationships to the social world were ideas from Asian religious traditions, particularly South Asian religious traditions, that really my father sort of provided me with. Books like Autobiography of a Yogi, the Dhammapada, Teachings of the Buddha. And that was sort of a beginning point for just exploring, different perspectives on how to relate to the world, but also really thinking about this basic question of suffering and where we as humans are in the world. And so that was sort of a beginning point just conceptually for connecting to Asian religious traditions. And really through my years in high school, sort of exploring some of that, also exploring some basic techniques of meditation, like looking at your breath and things like that. Again, these were ideas that my father taught me about, and at these times where he said, hey, you're looking at these kinds of practices, maybe you want to try this kind of basic thing. And this sort of set me off to want to explore these ideas, which were really at that time more just ideas for the most part, in a more concrete way. So after high school, I took a year off and I went to India, just because I wanted to do something different. Sort of a classic story, go to India, learn about what's going on there and get involved in some of these traditions and practices. And so for me, a real turning point during that first year after high school in India was sitting a Vipassana meditation retreat with my teacher, S.M. Goenka. And I'm one among many, many people who have learned meditation from S.M. Goenka. And that really was a starting point for me to say, okay, this is something unique, learning how to be embodied and pull apart my experience in very particular ways that apparently the Buddha, taught. Let's explore this. And so upon returning from that first year in India, I was at a private college in the US, and I spent most of that first year at this private college just reading in translation everything I could about the early Buddhist tradition. So I read a lot of the discourses of the Buddha in English translation. I tried my best to really keep a meditation practice and really just get deep into it. And at the same time, I was studying history. I was sort of a history major, so I was reading about modern European history. I took a class in Indian history. I took courses on African colonial history. So this sort of interesting relationship for me between exploring history and exploring practice, meditation practice, and Buddhism through a historical lens. And that was sort of grounding for me in terms of my outlook. I think even to today, terms of how I relate to the practices that I still engage in is that I always sort of have a historical lens that I bring to it. And at the same time, history gives us this opportunity to really explore this notion of change and development and culture, different communities, right? Different frames of reference, different cosmologies, different ways of being in the world, in different places in the world. And so in some ways, going to India was an opening for that too. And also this is something that goes back for me, even I think to an earlier part of my identity, which is sort of the ethnographic lens that is so important in terms of just figuring out who we are as humans in the world. And this is something that's really kind of ancestral for me. I grew up in a family, my great-grandfather was an anthropologist. And I think this sort of anthropological idea was there really, like when I would interact with my grandmother, when I would interact with my father. There was this idea of like, we should make sure we think about other perspectives. Now, it's an interesting case. My great-grandfather was quite famous anthropologist. His name was Bronislaw Malinowski. So he's actually one of the most important figures in modern anthropology. He sort of founded the tradition of long-term field work. He's really the father of the British School of Anthropology. This idea that you go and you spend a lot of time in a place, you really immerse yourself in a community and you figure it out. You figure out what's going on. And I think this seed was there for me, very much in my upbringing and in my interest to go abroad to India as well.
That's so interesting. I noticed that the M in your middle name was Malinowski. And I thought briefly, I wonder if there's a connection, but I didn't realize that was your great-grandfather.
Yeah, it is. And so I think that seed is part of this, but also my interest in history in many ways sort of rubs up against the classic functionalist approach of Malinowski. And I can see really in much of my formation and in much of the formation of like the modern academy, this kind of interesting rub. And in many ways that's there with me through a lot of my work and my research. But also something to think about ancestrally is Malinowski was always lauded as someone who was very sensitive to the communities he studied, right? He was really trying to understand them. And then there was, of course, this key moment where his diary was published by his second wife, and it was quite a controversy. And it turned out that Malinowski was actually really racist. He had major problems with the natives. He was not this sensitive guy we always knew. And he was highly ambitious, obsessed with his career. He, in fact, neglected his wife and daughters to pursue his career. And at the same time, he had, a mistress, and all of these things. We might be getting off track here, but this is something for me that's really interesting when we think about what it means to be a scholar, right?
And what it means to be a responsible scholar, someone who's inheriting the insights of caring about other people's perspectives as a good anthropologist does, but also being aware of the way that can be sort of sit alongside perhaps sort of racist or colonialist or, complex ethical situations. And so the fact that all of this is informing your scholarship is a really interesting, outlook to have had so early on.
Right, and I'm not sure I had that outlook early on, but I think I had these influences early on, and in time and now I have some perspective on how these different influences have informed my scholarship and have, in fact, I think, given me more resources in many ways to have a perspective now across the different projects I've engaged in, and also in the different encounters I continue to have, right, cross-culturally, within power dynamics, both in academia, but also outside of academia in my fieldwork, in my work on manuscripts and ancient Buddhist traditions, and in my work of just trying to understand my own relationship to, say, practices that are from other places that I've taken on in different ways um, that and how I can sort of position myself or be aware of my positionality as I do the work I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it sounds like you, as someone who has practiced these traditions, found them personally meaningful at a time in your life where, you know, I can totally identify with that feeling myself, of feeling lost in that high school period and reading my first book on Buddhism and saying, oh, wow, you know, somebody has had these questions before. But then also having this sort of historicizing impulse, which we could almost say, you know, practicing a tradition is viewing the tradition from the inside. A historian's viewpoint sometimes says, okay, like, let's step outside and try to view the sweep of history. Of course, we can never stand fully outside the sweep of history or power or any of these kinds of things. But it sounds like all of these perspectives were sort of informing your journey, even if
Right,
you
and
didn't
they
fully
did, and
understand
so
it at the
that,
time.
sorry to interrupt,
No,
and
no.
they had, all of those things were there in that moment, my first year in college. And I was at a private school in the US, and I had been a year in India, and actually I found myself oppressed in many ways by the kind of culture of this small private college in the United States. And at that moment, although I very much appreciated these really wonderful teachers I had who were teaching me about history, really, I studied some aspects of political science, political theory, and cultural studies. These things were actually really valuable in the long term. But at the same time, I felt very much oppressed particularly after a year in India, having a lot of freedom, just practicing meditation, traveling, and feeling really like I wanted to be in a different kind of place. So after my first year of college, I actually transferred out of this small private college in the US into a freer program. This is, I don't know if you've ever heard of it's actually now only a program at the University of Long Island, but it began as a Quaker school of its own called Friends World College. And I think by the time I was there, it had become Friends World Program, and it was accredited through the Long Island University system. And this was actually an experiential learning college developed by some hippie Quakers in the 60s that said, hey, our education system is basically broken. Um, if we just sit around in the university context and sort of, think about the world divorced from it, we're going to be setting ourselves up for some real problems. So they developed this experiential learning program where the model was basically you travel around the world. There are different centers at different places in the world. And I think the time when I entered the program, there were centers in Ghana, China, Costa Rica, Bangalore in South India, in Japan, and a few other places that I'm probably forgetting, a few sites in Europe. I think there was a center in London. And the idea of this program was to travel, study different cultures and communities in context, make sure you study at least 2 languages, live in at least 2 different countries outside of your home country during your period of study, and generally and very broadly do a core liberal arts curriculum that develops in relationship to these areas that you're interested in. So I found that really compelling as an idea. And for me, it was actually quite wonderful as a program, despite the fact that it had very limited resources and the kind of structure of study was very loose. For me, it worked really well. I went and I spent a year in Japan, and then I spent 3 years in India as part of that. I studied Japanese, I studied Hindi, I studied Pali, the ancient language of the early Buddhist scriptures, or one of them. And I found this was a great way for me to sort of develop these interests that I had both in my meditation practice, my interests in these different areas, but also in history, and then in ethnographic connections to place and community in these different areas of the world.
Yeah, you really do get such a different picture of what Buddhism is, or what any religious practice is, when you're reading it in a book in the type of liberal arts classrooms that often exist in North America that prioritize a certain view of what knowledge is, versus going and actually sort of interacting with people and spending time there. So that sounds like a really valuable experience. And so,
Yeah, and I found it really wonderful. I do think there were limitations to that kind of study. And so when I did finish, I found myself kind of in between worlds in many ways. And I thought, how can I sort of continue to explore these ideas in the way that I have been? And in the end, I went to a PhD program, which is probably not the best place to explore these things in that same way that I had been doing. So I went to the University of California at Berkeley. I got myself deeply immersed into really a classical Buddhist studies model where I was going to study the ancient languages. I was going to explore the texts and histories in a very formal, philological fashion. But also one great benefit of the Buddhist Studies program at Berkeley is there is a fairly strong theoretical focus around kind of what Buddhism is, how does it fit in with a larger landscape of religious studies and things like that. But in many ways, it was going from a very free, open model of experiential learning to a fairly rigid and quite traditional academic context at UC Berkeley. In retrospect, I see this as a kind of wonderful balance. At the same time, I think entering grad school and doing almost 10 years of grad school in that frame was actually conditioning in a really different way than my early experiential learning as an undergraduate. I like the fact that I have this balance and perspective. In many ways, coming out of 10 years in a PhD program, I found myself sort of more inclined towards the experiential and wanting to break free in a sense of some of the constraints of some of the more formal aspects of academic culture.
mm-hmm. At the time when you were in grad school, were you feeling this as a kind of constraint that was limiting, or did you, while you were there, kind of dive into it?
Yeah, I think there was an ambiguity there all along. And this has to do with identity and issues of, what are you allowed to be, as an academic? That historicist kind of perspective really is very powerful. And the idea that, well, we should always step back and be able to be objective to some extent. And yes, as you pointed out, that's never truly possible. And so I found myself more and more moving back to a frame of reference which says, well, I should be really clear and include myself and my perspective in how I do my work. That doesn't mean I don't do historical work. That doesn't mean I'm not historicist in many of my basic relationships to the work that I do. But it's a more honest theoretical stance, I think. And so I did find at certain moments a sense of critique emerging from myself when I looked at some of the kind of assumptions that many of my teachers and colleagues were making in their approaches. But I also saw this on the other side. I mean, some people were much more willing to position themselves and put themselves theoretically into things. And I found myself wanting to explore that gray area. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where most of us and many of us as academics find ourselves. And the question is when and where and how do you negotiate it? And what's your project, right? And since I've done quite a few different kinds of projects, in many ways, I see that my project often conditions the stance I will take and the politics that I end up choosing to engage in. And so for me, that's sort of like an ongoing project. Like, where do I stand politically, and do I need to intervene in some way here, or can I step back and just describe? And there's just this constant balancing act, I think, that scholars have to participate in, particularly when you're part or feel part of a certain tradition or a set of communities that might be invested in the tradition, in ways that maybe just like a scholar over here wouldn't be invested in the traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in certain ways, scholarship feels like an act of communication. And so it's always coming from a certain place, it's always speaking towards a certain audience, and where you feel yourself sort of speaking to multiple audiences or some audiences, where you're coming from, what work your scholarship is meant to do, is going to really shape how you position yourself at any point. And it certainly seems like the sort of scope of your work coming out of grad school and then in more recent times has made almost a kind of shift from, you have this like very, very serious philological work that I want to talk about, but then I've also moved into new sorts of work more recently. So maybe we could trace that. And I'm sure, some folks listening who may not be as familiar with academic Buddhist studies hear this talk of, a traditional or a philological kind of education in Buddhist studies, and they're like, what is that? What does that mean? So maybe you could tell us about some of this early work on the Prajnapada Sutra and just the early meditation texts in the Buddhist tradition. And then even if you could speak to, what does it mean to have a traditionalist, philological Buddhist studies education?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, right, I think Buddhist studies is actually an interesting category. I don't think it's really one thing. In many ways, it looks different depending on where you study it, who you're studying it with, and who's defining it. I would say that my training really comes out of what we might call the European Indological tradition. So the study of Buddhism in its cultural context in South Asia, right? An area-focused approach, a language-focused approach, where you realize that sort of the history of ethnic communities, language communities, and then religious communities that are often inflected around those kinds of identities kind of get formed. And so this is, when we think about classical Indology, which often sort of becomes Buddhist studies when you're focusing on Buddhism, we're really thinking about trying to recover sort of the context, the social attitudes, the cosmologies of communities in early South Asia who had a relationship to the teachings of the Buddha and were trying to, in some way, follow those teachings and enact the kind of ideas that were there within the teachings that were attributed to the historical Buddha. And this is done in a classical sense by reading ancient texts, learning the ancient languages, and really trying our best with a lot of care to go into those early worlds of thought, early worlds of practice, through the textual traditions. This is usually what we have, or if maybe we have archaeological evidence, right? The kind of evidence we might have for those ancient times, are really going into those materials and trying to, as best as we can, to understand them in their own context and on their own terms. And right, if you're doing this historically, you're reliant really on the sources, and classical Indology, classical Buddhist studies tends to say, let's go learn the ancient languages and really unearth the context. This, for Buddhist studies, involves not just learning Sanskrit and Pali, which are sort of some of the most common language traditions that in which the sources we have been preserved, but also learning about the Prakrit traditions of the Jains with whom the Buddha was in dialogue, the many early, what we now call Hindu traditions that were also in dialogue with those communities, the Brahminical traditions, other ascetic communities who were in dialogue with the Buddha, what they were up to. And since Buddhism died out in India fairly early on historically, I mean, it's a big controversy exactly when, but in terms of really being like a big piece of Indian culture or South Asian culture. By the 15th century of the Common Era, it's not really something we can talk about in any obvious way. And so a lot of what we have to understand that earlier tradition, in fact, is not preserved in India. It's preserved in other places like Tibet, China, Southeast Asia. So now if you want to understand the earliest traditions of Buddhism, you also have to learn other languages and learn about other communities that have transmitted these traditions in Tibetan language, in Chinese language, in various Southeast Asian languages, in Sinhalese, in Sri Lanka, places like that, many other places in Afghanistan, Central Asian languages. So, if you're really trying to understand these traditions as best you can, you actually have to explore like quite broadly a range of different cultural contexts, and if you can, a range of different classical languages in which the traditional teachings and texts and practices were preserved.
Mhm. Yeah, when I think of a classically trained Buddhologist, someone in this sort of European Indology tradition that you think of, I think of someone who not only knows Sanskrit and Pali and Prakrit, but they know classical Chinese, they know literary Tibetan, they know probably Japanese and German and French to read other philologists writing about these things. And it's all in service of getting back at kind of as close as you can to the original way that these texts would have been interpreted, understood, and practiced. And, by contrast, someone so I was trained in a context that was almost in reaction to this type of scholarship. And so as a Tibetanist, folks would almost say, look, I don't really care how these texts were interpreted in their earliest context. I'm interested in how Tibetans received them and what these texts came to mean. And so the sort of more classical tradition was aimed at these very, very early periods of Buddhist history and doing really, really careful, detailed work, often with texts that we only have parts of, or maybe we have part of it in a palm leaf manuscript, and then part of it in a Chinese translation, and part of it in a Tibetan translation, and doing this work to get to editions of these early texts. And so your work did that with early meditation sutras in Dirghagama Buddhist tradition. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about what these texts are and what they signify about how meditation was understood at this early period.
Right. So one point, just to position myself, Kate, is I think I like you was sort of also reacting in many ways to this basic idea of like, we're going to just unearth the earliest tradition. At the same time, I very much participated in that imaginary, like it would be great if we could go back and really understand who the Buddha was historically. And so some of the early work I did and continue to do is sort of really take seriously the earliest text that we have as possibly representing kind of some original form of Buddhism. And I actually thought, well, it'd be worthwhile to try to figure that out.
Yeah, and I would interject that, when I say, I've been trained in this sort of like reception history form of Buddhist studies that is practiced by some people nowadays, I always feel really jealous, actually, of folks who have this great classical understanding because, we can be critical of it in various ways. It is always impossible to get to this earliest thing. But I like the way you phrase that, of taking seriously these earliest texts as the closest thing that we have to represent what the historical Buddha would have taught to his students. And so I am by no means denigrating this classical form of Buddhist studies scholarship.
Well, I might denigrate it. But I feel more comfortable doing it to some extent to denigrate it. I wouldn't exactly use that word, but I like the idea because I think it's fair to critique this approach. And I think I've become more and more critical of such an approach, the idea that it would be a worthwhile project to recover, say, the earliest teachings by sifting and dividing out and really finding some kernel of true history in these ancient texts, I've become more and more critical of that, primarily because I've done that work. I've really tried hard at different moments in my trajectory to really do that work. And I'm in dialogue with scholars who are highly invested in that kind of project. And what I've noticed in my own carrying out of that work and in my conversations with the people who continue to carry it out is that there's almost always some assumptions hidden behind that kind of work. And that usually when you bring those assumptions to the table, it will very quickly call into question how seriously we should take the conclusions of those kinds of projects. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do those projects. And in fact, I still want to do them. But in a sense, we should take the reception history idea that you're talking about and put it all the way back and realize that basically, and this is something I think that anyone who does historical work on ancient traditions ends up realizing at a certain point, that interpretation has gone on forever. Reconstruction and construction and reconstruction is ongoing and has always been ongoing. That's part of the game. So by looking at that truth, that fact of history, right, you actually might have a better chance of getting something like what we're actually after. But you have to bring your assumptions to the table and you have to be honest about them. This is something that I've seen most of my classical Buddhologist friends being very bad at. And so I think my approach is, yeah, let's do that work, but let's be honest about our assumptions. And once you do that, you realize actually you can be a little more free in a sense with how you relate to the tradition. This also means that like my relationship to practice traditions, my personal investments in, say, understanding the Buddha's teachings as something I want to maybe do or relate to personally, can have a place in doing ancient historical work. And I don't have to sort of stand back and pretend that I'm totally separate from it. In fact, it might be more honest to bring these things to the table and participate in a historical project that allows for me playing a role in constructing who the Buddha was, what his teachings were. And this isn't in many ways where some of my work ends up going in more recent articles and books that I've written, and really in my dissertation research, which became a book looking at a text that really does stand in between the earliest Buddhist traditions and then more fully developed later traditions that we might think of as the ones that end up going to Tibet and being received. And so really looking at transitional moments in history becomes the most interesting thing to do in a sense, because you allow yourself to take the ancient traditional ideas and see that they were always dynamic, always on the move, always being interpreted, and always part of communities, always the property of people who were doing stuff with them. And so thinking about what people have done with the tradition and how they've experienced the tradition, how their ways of thinking, their ways of practicing have conditioned developments in the history of Buddhism. And this is particularly interesting for me, at least with my interest in contemplative practices and meditation, is to think how actually contemplative practices and people's personal engagement in real meditation practices and traditions actually is a dynamic mode, right? It's actually probably one of the key conditioning factors in changes that happened within Buddhist tradition. Now, this is a controversial assertion, actually. And I wonder if you think it's controversial, Kate, when I say that, contemplative practices in Buddhist meditation is a key conditioning factor in how Buddhism develops in history. Is that something that kind of stands out to you as an idea that you would agree with, or push back against, or take for granted, or not take for granted?
So I would definitely say that my approach is that yes, Buddhism is always changing. People are always sort of receiving it, reinterpreting it, relating it to its circumstances. And then the question is, what is the key driver of that? And whether we can say, that contemplative practices are a key driver of changes in Buddhism, or maybe philosophical developments are a key driver of Buddhism. Or we might say that, socioeconomic material conditions are what drives changes in Buddhism. Or we might say that culture, when Buddhism jumps from India to China is a major period of change. And so that's really interesting. I never considered that contemplative traditions themselves would be a strong driver of change. But then again, my scholarship hasn't dealt so much with contemplative traditions. I certainly would agree with the fact that they are probably a large driver, and that Buddhist kind of experiences of that had in meditation or sort of arising from contemplative practices as a driver of change. I think I would agree with that. I would say that certainly sort of a lot of the forces in early Mahayana, it would make a lot of sense to see these as developments of understandings of Buddhist doctrines that occur through deep engagement with these texts in meditative contexts.
Yeah, so I think you raise really interesting questions, right? When you bring in these other conditioning factors. And I think this is a key controversy, at least in the world of classical Buddhist studies that I came up in. Really, there was a moment, I think, in the 90s, up until the 90s, in classical Buddhist studies, it was sort of taken for granted that meditation, contemplative practices are really important in Buddhism. The Buddha seemed to have spent a lot of time teaching people to do these practices. The early communities seem to have been sort of rallying around these monks doing a lot of these practices. So it's obviously really important. But really a shift in Buddhist studies happened where there was this idea like, no, we need to talk about all these other factors. We're focusing too much on meditation and contemplation to define Buddhism, right? There are all these other things, the ones you pointed out, the socioeconomic context, philosophical ideas, right? And one interesting thing I think happened, particularly starting from the 90s onward, and there are a number of key scholars that were responsible for this, like people like Gregory Chopin, who said we need to get down and dirty with like the on the ground kind of monastic institutions and what they were doing. And like we need to move away from this kind of romantic assumption about Buddhism being all about meditation. And I've pointed out that this is really important. And in fact, it gives us a much bigger picture of what Buddhism was. And so in fact, this is really important. And in fact, that's why we get these ideas of reception being more important and reception happening in a very broad range of contextual ways, right? Which includes, new cultures, new socioeconomic models, right? All of these kinds of different interests that are at work. At the same time, I also ended up feeling like this push against sort of romanticizing and saying that, well, no, Buddhism's not about meditation, it's not about contemplation. In fact, in the 90s, there was this narrative that in fact got created that no one ever meditated, really. In fact, when we look historically, no one meditated, they were just doing all this other stuff. They were either philosophers or they were doing rituals, which of course meditation can be understood as a mode of ritual, or contemplation can be. But this is, again, where you actually have a certain problem with modern categories being imported onto ancient traditional ideas. Now that was an important thing to happen because it gave us much more, a push to give much more attention to other things, particularly in classical Indology, which had been sort of focused on the more romantic version of Buddhism, right? And in many ways, this contributed to to strange ideas, like either the earliest form of Buddhism was like the true pure Buddhism, and then everything else later is a corruption, right? Which is, for instance, if you're a Tibetologist, really problematic, because that means that like we want to, this notion of, for instance, Lamaism, right, which is this very pejorative idea, it emerges from this basic frame, which is that, some earlier pure tradition, which was just about, meditation and some kind of pure early Buddhism is the only thing we should take seriously. And then everything else is this sort of corruption. And that's a classic dichotomy that is still with us, and particularly strong in modern framings of the Buddhist tradition. So I think what I found interesting about studying texts that weren't just the early tradition anymore, but were also still tied to that, right? And then were central in sort of driving other developments, to see that meditation might have actually played a role in that, not on its own, or not like as the key driver or the only driver, but as still fundamentally important for a number of reasons. I feel like that's been an important thing to do. And one interesting way of thinking about this fits with sort of more recent developments in sort of theoretical framings of unearthing what people did in history. So, for instance, scholars like, there's a guy named Nicholas Witkowski who's sort of returning to asceticism in the earlier texts and saying, well, it may in fact be the case that there was a lot more ascetic practice going on within Buddhism. There was a lot more things that we don't see that much of in the texts, because the people practicing them were not sort of the normative mainstream Buddhists who people wanted to talk about in their texts, right? And I think the same thing can be said about possibly practitioners of meditation. They find their way into the text more as these sort of, other folks. Why? Because you had a more mainstream of Buddhist tradition that actually found these people problematic, in a sense, the people who were sort of out on their own doing things. And so when you say early Mahayana might have been influenced by this, right? This is an idea that some of these early Mahayana practitioners were, in a sense, sort of, non-normative, right? They were, we talk about mainstream Buddhism, and then we talk about Mahayana Buddhism. Precisely that sets up this idea that, there was some basic mainstream core, and then there were Mahayanists. But we might actually think about this not just as mainstream and Mahayana, but, for instance, the work of Nicholas Witkowski suggests that ascetics who may not have been Mahayanists were being sort of sidelined for various reasons. One reason is that they were relating to kind of lower caste worlds that a mainstream of Buddhist thought didn't want to be associated with. Why? Maybe for socioeconomic reasons, right? This is where we realize that meditation, asceticism, and things like that actually can't be sort of set apart over here from socioeconomic models, the social context, right? And this is also why meditation can't ever go away, because the ideal practitioner often is the meditator, right? And the ideal practitioner then is the ideal person to give a donation to, right? So how does meditation play into that basic relationship that's core to the early tradition, which is not only a metaphysical relationship, but also a socioeconomic relationship? So when you start looking broadly at changes in history, you realize, oh, wow, we have to take all of these things into account. And meditation is one key piece of it. And if you take it out of the picture, you actually might be missing something really big going on, even if it's not always obvious that it is at the center of the picture. And this is sort of a theoretical move you have to make. You have to recover the sort of things that have been marginalized and understand why and how they've been marginalized, or have, things like that.
Yeah, one of the interesting moves in scholarship, and this is sort of a value judgment on the part of scholars, is do we say that we care about what a small number of highly dedicated, quote unquote, elite practitioners are doing, or do we care about the kind of the 99% of what most people are doing? And so in some ways, Gregory Chopin's work about what most people were doing most of the time, and this notion that elite meditative practice is a key driver of Buddhist development and change can kind of sit alongside one another. Because another key thing about meditators and how they may have driven changes is to say that the continual revelation of Buddha Vachana, of the word of the Buddha, which particularly in the development of the Mahayana and the development of Buddhism in India and as it moves elsewhere, is that new texts keep being written. And one of the continual questions for scholars is, where do these come from? And, I certainly don't have any answers for that. But one strong hypothesis we could make is that certain Buddhist practitioners in states of meditation felt themselves to be accessing a new understanding, a new turning of the wheel, a new sort of way in which the Buddha's word becomes revealed. And so we can definitely see that meditators, even if they're a relatively small number relative to the total, Buddhist population, are highly influential in laying out new paths that then may come to be adopted by more people.
Yeah, I think you're right there, but I would actually even push back against this basic idea, because this is an argument from silence. That's what we have to realize. So is what Gregory Chopin studied, the 99%, the elite people who transmitted these Vinaya texts, right? Is that really what everyone was doing? No, it's a picture of what some people wanted us to think people were doing, or how they were exploring it, right? So for instance, when you see meditators depicted in the Vinaya as these dirty, gross people who you want to stay away from, or as problems, and this is, something that we see, right? And in fact, people have used this as an argument for why no one was doing meditation. I think it's actually, historically and theoretically speaking, we might read against the grain there, and this is sort of some of the idea that Chopin himself has worked with. We should read these texts against the grain. This is the argument that Nicholas Witkowski's making about ascetic practices. It's a similar argument that Amy Langenberg has made for trying to get at what nuns and women in Buddhism were doing. It's that if you actually make the argument from silence that, we don't see these meditators, and when we do see them, they're like bad people or problematic people, precisely that evidence should tell us that maybe they were, in fact, there were maybe more of them, precisely because they were a problem. They were sort of excluded, right? Just like the ascetic practitioners created this problem because they were, not in the more pure realm that the image of the good, pure Buddhist should have been in, right? So it's strange to me that pretty much everyone has taken this argument from silence, like no one meditated, when in fact those theoretical moves suggest precisely the opposite, that maybe a lot of people did. So even the arguments about the Mahayana developing out of these few people doing these special practices on the side, that might very well be true. And of course, Jen Nadier's work on A Few Good Men is a wonderful example of that. But at the same time, that might even be ignoring a larger core of people who were practicing meditation more broadly that we just can't see. And when we do see them, we see them from a perspective of the mainstream, which is not really probably the mainstream. It in fact might be the 1% that you're talking about, right? These elite people who are producing the texts that we have, right? The literate, literati, cognoscenti producing these materials. And then who knows who the mainstream really was, right? We see them only through certain lenses. And so for me, it's more raising that question. And then when we do look at what happens, right? What people are doing more broadly, we seem to see a lot more of practice on the ground once we get to history, right? So for instance, you studied Tibetan Buddhism, right? I mean, it's just so hard not to see how influential some of these meditation practice traditions just continue to be through all the lineages, even if it's just rhetorical. But I think it's much more than that. I think historically on the ground, we can see that. And so is that a corruption of a mainstream Buddhism? Those are the kinds of questions I think we should all be exploring at this point. It's really a theoretical question that remains with us. So thinking about ascetic practitioners as subalterns, as Nicholas Witkowski has done, we might more broadly think about contemplatives as possibly having become subalterns in some way, even though many of them may have been elites too, right? And so this is the interesting question to raise. And in some ways, looking historically at meditation should allow us a way into some of these bigger theoretical questions, precisely because there seems to be such a clear idea now that, like, oh, only a few people meditated, right?
It's become one of the truisms, and very frequently if people ask me, like, oh, what's the one misconception about Buddhism that comes up frequently, I'm dealing with students often who think that to be a Buddhist is to meditate. And so I'm pushing back against that by saying, most Buddhists through most periods of history did not meditate, would have seen that as an elite practice for monks that maybe they would have donated money to, but the practice appropriate to them where they were on the Buddhist path was more likely dana and generosity. That was the sort of stage on this gradual path. But anything that becomes orthodoxy, should be questioned. And what you're pointing us to is that we know so little about these very early periods of Buddhist history. We know so little about so much of Buddhist history that we should not allow our sort of wanting to push back against the modern narrative that Buddhism is meditation swing to the total other end of the pendulum of no Buddhist ever meditated, or the kind of softer version which I give to my students, and maybe after this conversation I won't say this anymore, but I say 95% of Buddhists probably never meditated a day in their life, before a certain period in history where it became this mass practice. Do you think that even that may be too strong?
Well, I think those are fair statements to make in general terms. But again, this is also where I would open up the category of meditation. And this is something that I think has been done by a lot of reflective scholars, which is that precisely if dana is a step on a gradual path, and right, this is even there in the earliest basic models of the gradual path, you begin with dana and then you deconstruct karma, right? And this is a teaching given to lay people regularly, right? Dana is good. It gets you so much in a karmic trajectory, and then you have to deconstruct karma, right? Which is basically a fundamental outlook for meditation, right? And so when we think about bhavana, right, as, at first shila and morality, and then giving as good karmic practice, and then bhavana, which is this idea of cultivating oneself, right, which begins with those practices and then sort of enters into meditation in its higher stages. And again, meditation here, maybe we can talk about it in formal, concentrated states of deep bliss, but really meditation and contemplation is on that kind of spectrum with moral cultivation, right? The cultivation of good karma in relationship to a Buddhist community, right? And then possibly that leading into kind of higher states of development, beginning with an insight into the Four Noble Truths, which again, often in the traditional early models happens hearing the Dharma, right? In the context of hearing the Dharma. So again, is that meditation? Maybe not formally in the path models we have set out by, in the classical models of the Buddha's teaching. But really, when I talk about meditation and cultivation, I think it's this broader category. And if you take seriously the structure of the Buddhist path, right, we don't set up meditation or contemplation like up over there as sort of this other thing. So when we make that move, oh, no one meditated in history, what are we really saying, right? We're saying, well, no one can really accomplish these high states of meditation or something. But since the whole tradition conceptualized this always as a spectrum of cultivation, right? We're actually creating a category that doesn't necessarily fit that well with the early conceptualizations around what cultivation or bhavana could have been, right?
Yeah, often
and I'm not saying...
Often what I'm telling my students is most Buddhists throughout history didn't do what you think of meditation as doing, which, my students think of meditation. You sit down, you close your eyes, you try not to think for 30 minutes. And so yeah, this question of what is meditation. And, you can look, I always hate to bring in Tibetan examples because it's so on the nose, but, like an older Tibetan woman circumambulating a stupa while spinning a prayer wheel while, thumbing mani. I'd be hard pressed to look at that and say that that is not a person who is like cultivating and focusing the mind. And certainly one of the texts that I love to teach is Charles Hallisey's translation of Advice to the Layman Tundila, of one of these, graduated teachings where lay people start with generosity, move up through various stages of deconstructing where they were on the path, eventually to the city of bliss, as it's called in that text. And the whole thing is conceptualized as training of the mind, right? There is no point on the Buddhist path where you are not actively engaging and cultivating the mind so as to make more real the realizations that are ultimately going to lead you further down the path.
Yeah, so I'm sort of in that same frame, and I don't think we should kind of over-determine in that way either, right? Because there are clear distinctions, and then there are clear different modes, right, of practice technically, right? But for sure, I think I think the problem we have is we do have a lot of modern Buddhist thinking meditation is one thing, and they would actually look at that Tibetan woman circumambulating and spinning the wheel, and they would kind of criticize that as that's not meditation, or that's not really what the Buddha taught. And I think, for me, it's clearly a problem to do something like that. At the same time, I think it's fair to make a distinction between sort of what that is doing or could be doing in the broader schemes of the path that we have, and then, these other kind of cultivating practices that might look different, or, might be a little more kind of grounded in something internal, right? I do think a lot of this plays out around conceptualizations of like sort of meditation as an internal state, that's not got to do with external realities. And since that's just not ever, I think, been what Buddhist meditation was understood to be, we have to immediately just pull that apart. And I think we know as scholars of religious studies that a lot of these sort of assumptions really do come more from Protestant tradition, from definitions of religion that are, as we all know, quite Christian, and in many ways in relationship to Asia, colonial. And so I think, yeah, just being aware of those distinctions and always bringing the kinds of conversation we're having here, bringing these distinctions to the table and like putting them out in front of us, like we often assume these things, and this is what meditation means. And yeah, going back to that category of bhavana, right? Of shila, of dana, like taking those categories and fitting them into a classical idea of the path. Again, so shila, cultivation of moral virtues, right? Dana, giving, and then bhavana, this category, which is very broad, cultivating oneself, sort of mental states which are internal but are almost always also relational to external kinds of practices. Karma, understanding what you do, and then understanding that what you do is impermanent, right? That's a key function of insight meditation, right? Which is a mode of bhavana cultivation. So in the course, we're going to be talking about like these native terms, right? These classical early terms, and how once we actually get into the world of this terminology, it might help us shift some of these assumptions, right? About what meditation is, what contemplation is. Once you use the word bhavana and you distinguish it from, say, samadhi, a deep state of concentration, and realize that actually they're related in certain ways, then you start being able to open up to a conceptual world that isn't constrained by some of these assumptions. Yeah.
Because it certainly feels like I can have whole conversations with people in the modern world out on the street where we're talking about meditation and we are talking about two different things, right? And so part of the sort of historical move that you're making in both your scholarship and it sounds like in BSO 102 is to okay, say, okay, in this period, what are the relevant terms? How are they defined? Where do they get used? How are they related to each other? Here at this next, maybe this next transitional period, what are the relevant terms? How do they relate to each other? How are they used? And then once you have that kind of more detailed picture of what the relevant language is, what the relevant sort of texts are, then you can raise the question of change over time. Whether the same words are being used in slightly different contexts, whether new words are being used, whether the same words are being used but attached to new kinds of practices or new kinds of ideals. And so, perhaps this is, a great opportunity to jump into talking about, Buddhist meditation in theory and practice. So where are folks going to start with this? The course is broken up into 4 modules. Where are you going to sort of lay out the picture of where we start?
Right, so we begin in the first module really grounding ourselves in the earliest period of Buddhism as we can access it through the discourses of the Buddha that we have. And we're going to use primarily English translations of the Pali suttas or discourses of the Buddha to do that. But of course, I'm going to lay out a larger historical picture also of sort of the context in which the historical Buddha, as we can know him, was doing his teachings, right? He was talking to people from all walks of life in early South Asia. Some of them had different kinds of commitments, either, cosmological commitments or particular social commitments, maybe in relationship to some kind of caste-like model or something like that, or they were invested in certain kind of family commitments and he was trying to get them to become monastics. These kinds of questions around the social context in which he was teaching, and a lot of the basic assumptions that he had and shared with a lot of the people he was talking to. So trying to get a basic historical picture of the Buddha's context as best as we can, and then looking in particular at some of the specific practices that he taught, and then really first the ones he himself engaged with before coming to his own realizations about the final goal of enlightenment or awakening, and then how he kind of brought that understanding to others through quite a range of different models of teaching and particular, say, techniques of meditation practice.
Mm-hmm. Maybe just because I heard you say enlightenment or awakening, you can speak to sort of a discussion that's come up in BSO 101, which is, I see you sort of saying both terms. What informs your choice of when to use the term enlightenment, when to use the term awakening? I've been one of the folks who's largely made the shift to awakening, but recently read an article by Bhikkhu Bodhi that was, in favor of enlightenment. What is your sort of sense or what informs your choice of how to describe this sort of state to which Buddhists aspire?
Yeah, so again, I use enlightenment or awakening because everyone knows enlightenment and it's common. I haven't read Bhikkhu Bodhi's article, I don't think, but I imagine I can probably relate to arguments he might make for why we should just use enlightenment. There are actually good kind of reasons from the early tradition that enlightenment might work. I mean, particularly the depiction, for instance, in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta of light kind of emerging, because enlightenment is so loaded as a historical term relating to other kinds of things, I've found myself wanting to be more in line with really the classical understanding of the term bodhi, right, which is quite literally this sense of to wake up, awakening. So I play with both sides, and that's why I say enlightenment or awakening. And also we have to be just aware of colloquialisms and common usage in any case. The issue with a course like this is that you're always fudging translation. You're always in between. And even like the text we're using, we'll be translating some key terms differently. And this is a huge difficulty. So like some of the basic categories of like samatha meditation, right, which often gets translated as calming, but it also gets translated as serenity. It also gets translated as tranquility. I can think of primary sources that we're reading in this course, which you translate that very same word in all of those three ways. It's not a radical difference, but it might be for someone who reads it one way or another and assumes, oh, tranquility means X, calming means X, serenity means X, right? So the key idea here is that any word you use, right, the word in and of itself, you can't just take the meaning like awakening or enlightenment and say this means something outside of a structure, right? Outside of a structure of practice, a larger set of relationships that are historically constructed, right? So part of the goal in using this kind of terminology is to first get you to a starting point, and then at a certain point, whether it's enlightenment or awakening doesn't matter as much anymore, because you have a structure within which the term has a meaning. Mm-hmm. Whether you say enlightenment or awakening, you know what you're actually talking about more broadly, and then the actual translation term has less importance. Mm-hmm. This is sort of my take on translation more generally. I understand that many people would come down differently on this. Like that's one of the issues I have with some of the classical Buddhist studies models. There's an idea that there's one right way to translate things. If you get that right, then you're going to actually somehow be transmitting like the true meaning of the tradition or something like that. I've not seen that to work. Since words are embedded in larger social structures, my approach to translation is that you give a translation a go, and if it comes across in a larger framework and people seem to get that larger framework, then you've succeeded. Not whether the word itself kind of like gets you the true meaning of the original ideas. It's never the case. It's translation. You know, at best, it's an approximation. Good translation is translating a whole picture, right? Not a word.
Yeah, and the sort of model of which word plus word plus word plus word equals meaning is perhaps less valuable than to say that the individual words get their meaning from the whole. And, right. That's also, one of the points about translation is, you can have these amazing words in Pali or Sanskrit, like Bodhi contains both of these metaphors of the bringing of light and waking up. But in English, you're forced to make the choice. Similarly, the range of meanings associated with dharma, can come from this root dur to hold up, to hold together. But in English, the sort of different words, different senses of meaning of dharma in the sense of doctrine or law, dharma in the sense of the Buddhist teachings, dharma in the sense of psychophysical particulars, you lose that relation when you're translating in English. So that broader point about translation is helpful. But I really derailed you from explaining the modules of Buddhist Studies 102.
Right. So that first module, right, we're starting with this basic early historical context of the Buddha and trying to focus on some of the practice models that became central to the Buddha's teachings and that also then carry on and have continuity into later history. And that sets us up for the later modules, right? So module 2, we're going to then look at sort of the shift first in South Asia to sort of Mahayanist approaches, or really outlooks that suggest that, the path could be longer than attaining enlightenment in this very life. Just as one soteriological option, it ends up being quite important historically. So we need to bring that to the table, particularly because we're going to then look at the transfer or transmission of some of these teachings and practices beyond South Asia. So the second module is really focused on the transmission to China, right, which is one of the earlier kind of cultural relationships that develops for Buddhism in Asia. This happens quite early, actually, right, in the early centuries of the Common Era. And so we're going to look in particular at two key practice lineages, the Tiantai lineage and the Chan or Zen lineage in China. And those are cases of these Buddhist traditions and many of the same basic ideas that we see in these earliest discourses of the Buddha being transmitted and transformed into a particularly Chinese form. And so both the Tiantai tradition and the Chan or Zen tradition really are cases of a uniquely Chinese set of traditions and practices that nonetheless very clearly draw and have continuities with some of these basic early practices. And the same thing goes for the third module, where we're going to look at a later transmission to Tibet, right, where we actually see some of the same dynamics. We're going to look at some particular practice traditions, this time, from around the 8th century, the early transmission into Tibet from India, which sets the stage for a fairly formal kind of scholastic model of meditation that becomes really central in traditions like, say, the Gelugpa tradition that we know today. And then we're going to look at a later tradition of the Great Perfection that actually has much earlier roots, but we're going to, because we have certain translations we want to draw on from the 18th century, that is draws on a broader repertoire of traditions coming out of India that we might generally call tantric. But also what's so interesting about the Tibetan context is really how it's very inclusivist. So many Tibetan traditions want to make sure that they include like all of what was there from earlier tradition. And so in many ways, this is a great example of where we see continuities in categories and ideas, even from the earliest tradition in the Great Perfection traditions or Dzogchen traditions, while at the same time, a fairly radical set of ideas about kind of directly seeing reality, which are much more tantric. And this term tantra and tantric, these are difficult ideas, which we will try to explore to some extent, but frankly, we're going to have to explore them in a very shallow way, precisely because you could teach an entire course on tantra and still not understand what it is.
Coming soon from Buddhist Studies Online.
Yes, so hopefully there'll be a good course on that. But the idea here is that in the Great Perfection traditions, we really can't separate these ideas from a guru-disciple relationship that involves initiation, that very much focuses on the fundamental power of a initiation, and then also ties into this basic idea that reality is here and now, directly to be accessed immediately, right? Even though there is this sort of background of a more gradual approach to meditation as well. So this is what we're going to be playing on in module 3, and this is actually kind of mirrors what's happening with the Chan and Zen traditions and the Tiantai traditions in China. So we're going to see some family resemblances here. So one thing we're trying to do in this course is look at really different cultural contexts and see real differences. And then at the same time, see that even though there are these fairly radical differences in sort of the way these transmissions have happened, both historically and culturally, there are these sort of core structuring categories that even go all the way back to the early tradition that end up being really consequential, even in kind of the first centuries of the Common Era in China and then medieval Tibet, for instance. And then that gets us to our final module, module 4, where we're going to see that some of these continuities even carry forward into modernity, Buddhism and Buddhist meditation spreading to the West and to North America and Europe, and then becoming fully global commodities. And despite them becoming global commodities in what we might call a late capitalist situation that we're all in right now, again, seeing some of these really interesting continuities with some of these core models from the early tradition and similar kind of mirrorings to what happens in China and what happens in Tibet.
Yeah, that's so interesting because in some ways, some folks think of modern meditation in the US as sort of directly transmitted from, the teachings of the Buddha. And, I would say that this sort of the popular view, right, is not so aware of the history of transformations that have occurred throughout Buddhist history. You also get a more sort of critical perspective that almost posits that there's a radical discontinuity when Buddhism and Buddhist meditation hits modernity, such that anything that is called sort of meditation or mindfulness in the modern context, it is no longer what it may have been in the past. And it sounds like you're charting quite Buddhistly a middle path through that of looking at, yes, what are the interesting transformations, but then also what are the key categories that carry through. Is that an accurate sort of summary?
Yeah, and I think in many ways the continuities are in some ways more powerful than many of us assume. And in some ways, like one of the really good examples of this is my own meditation teacher, S.N. Goenka, who, I have an ongoing research project on what he's done, but he's sort of understood to be one of these key figures that sort of took Buddhist meditation out of a kind of Southeast Asian context, brought it to India, reframed it, repackaged it for moderns, and disseminated it globally. This is a true story. What is not really understood is how kind of tied he himself was to the traditional categories. In fact, traditional categories that look to me, when I look at them, very much like the kind of categories that people like Tiantai Jieyi in China was involved in, people like Kamala Shila in Tibet were coming out of India, were involved in, ideas about karma and rebirth that are central to the teachings, the ideas about gradual development of perfections and how that's sort of central to how meditation should be understood. And in many ways, we often don't see some of these things because at their level of rhetoric, they've been sort of hidden from us. And so in many ways, sort of seeing where traditions change in terms of what they say and then what they actually do, and where can we see that and when do they get lost? So if we're thinking about like texts, and this is the same reason why I have a problem with the basic idea that, well, no one meditated in pre-modernity, because that's actually just a silence for the most part, right? And so if in modernity we can see like those kinds of silences because they're right in front of us, if I as a good historian go and unearth them, right, we should probably bring that basic perspective to earlier times in history. And so in many ways, seeing the radical changes, radical discontinuities with certain things, and then what does stick and what does drive certain developments. So I think a more clear radical reframing, and we're going to look at least a bit at this, is someone like Thich Nhat Hanh, right? It's much easier to see his mindfulness practices, even though they are actually grounded in some ways in certain very classical ideas, as quite explicitly engaging a more political frame that is quite obviously trying to depart from some of the more classical forms. Like that's an example where I think it's more clear what's being done, right? In other cases, what's being done is sort of a little more murky. And so a lot of what I think is interesting about studying Buddhism and modernity is looking at the more murky stuff. And we're going to try to touch on some of this, but also try to create some clarity as part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I had a teacher who said, in this Intro to Buddhism class, the two things you're going to learn are how to correctly spell the word Buddha, and then that everything you ever thought was wrong. And, from a student perspective, you want to balance the sort of the murky reality with some sense of the narrative. And it does sound like, one of the key themes will be, how meditation traditions get reimagined in particular cultural contexts, but then also that there are these, striking continuities in terms of the key categories or practices or ways in which mind is cultivated. And so, what do you think students taking this class are going to be most sort of struck or surprised by? What's the most sort of perhaps unexpected thing they might take away from this? That may be a very difficult question to ask.
That is a difficult question for me because I have no idea who might come to take the class. So usually if I would make a suggestion like that, I would probably have to create sort of a picture in my head of who's coming to take the class. My sense is people from a lot of different places would be interested in a class like this. And I imagine that many people taking this class would probably have some interest or investment in or an identity in one or another of the traditions we're studying here. And what I imagine is people might be on one level struck both by the continuities, right, and by some of the disjunctures they might have, the disjunctures they might not have known were there or might not have been pointed out to them, right? Because I think in so many contexts, we want to get the sense that what we have or what we've learned, right, is sort of directly from this one place, or there's usually a story we get, right, which gives us the sense that like these things we know about are this one thing. And my sense is that anyone taking this class is probably going to come out of this course thinking, well, a bunch of the things that I assumed about the history of Buddhist meditation, are different than I thought. Now, the question is, how are they different?
Yes.
Right? And I'm not sure I can say exactly how people will engage that question. It would be great if everything I taught in this class was just going to confirm what everyone already knew. That would mean people have done a lot of homework and really kind of thought about history and murky gray areas of the stories we tell ourselves about what Buddhism and Buddhist meditation are. But my sense is that most people will find at least pieces of this course kind of supportive and unsettling stories they have about Buddhist meditation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the course you're teaching is based on this sort of historical and academic perspective, but it is also, as you mentioned in the syllabus, probing how knowledge of Buddhist sources and practice models can help us think broadly about our own current context, and a lot of folks will also gain resources to explore their own practice interests. So let's say, a student comes to the course practitioner in a particular kind of lineage and finds himself both sort of reaffirmed in some of the key categories of what they're saying, but then also maybe unsettled in certain ways. How do you see a course like this focused on the history of meditation sitting with somebody who wants to put these things into practice? And as you've mentioned, these are questions that you have in relation to your own practice as well. So what do you think about a student like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. My basic idea about history is that it helps us, even if it might raise doubts for us. So my approach, for instance, in my own community of practitioners, is to always talk about sort of difficult things, right? Things that make us question the traditions we're in, or also force us to locate ourselves and our assumptions. And generally speaking, I think one basic issue I see broadly is that we tend to want things on our terms, wherever we are or whoever we might be. And again, that's a complex question because who are we? Like, who am I talking to? People are coming from a lot of different places. My general approach, and this in some ways really does go back to my Indological training, this idea that it's a really good idea to fully immerse ourselves as best we can in the context and historical relationships that gave rise to the traditions we're interested in. My sense is that a lot of folks like to read their traditions from a kind of modern's perspective, or the perspective of a modern. And hey, I guess we are. But in some ways, many of my experiences and relationships to traditional Buddhist practice have forced me out of some of my modernist frames. So in one sense, I feel like doing a serious study of ancient traditions that we might have already practiced to some extent, right, can force us out of our modern frame. And at the same time, it can make us realize how modern we actually are, or how stuck we are in some of these kind of modern perspectives. Again, I'm sort of one of those that believes we've never fully been modern, so I'm playing with this. Again, what is the modern? This is maybe something we should talk about. It's not going to be at the center of a course like this, but I think it's in the background, right? When you fully try to immerse yourself in an ancient set of practices that are really radically different from a radically different cultural place, from a radically different cosmological perspective from where we are, it should do some work for us. So if you are coming from a particular place, you believe you understand a practice you're doing, my sense is this course will both kind of mess with what you think your practice is and mess with who you think you are as a modern person. And that's actually the best place to be to practice meditation.
Yeah, going back to our earlier
of any sort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, going back to our earlier discussion of, enlightenment, awakening, and, that the fact that enlightenment plugs into the European Enlightenment. The one resonance I always really like is Immanuel Kant's definition of enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. That, we could make this more gender-friendly by people's emergence from their self-imposed immaturity, that in some sense, the encounter with history that challenges your assumptions that you bring out, all of those assumptions are self-imposed sort of limits on the way that you see yourself and your place in the world. And anything that challenges that or unsettles that, exactly as you're saying, is perhaps a good place to be in when you're, embarking on this process of meditation.
Exactly. And then I would say, great, such a good idea. Now Kant needs to realize that teleological narrative he had is within a certain cosmology, and he needs to maybe grow out of that. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of where we end up when we start taking seriously non-Western traditions and cosmologies as sort of still part of our modern conversation. Mm-hmm. So sort of allowing for multiple worlds to exist. So I'm sort of now in this world of the pluriverse. I think we need to be bringing like a pluriversal politics to the table. And I think Buddhist meditation is one place where pluriversal thinking, that is the idea that there are many worlds in which we live, like real, like worlds of experience and worlds of reality, helps us actually communicate better with people that might, in many ways, we might have a hard time communicating with. And this is actually a difficult theoretical question, and it won't be part of the course per se, but for me, it's sort of at the background of a course like this, which is that we're actually exploring real whole worlds of experience, like other universes in a sense, if we're serious. And meditation can be that too, right? Sitting in meditation and exploring the possibilities that are created by this mind-body interaction in relationship to a material reality, right? How do we explore that? Certain contemplative modes in Buddhism have real prescriptions for like quite radical and comprehensive modes of exploration like that. Fairly open-ended ones in some cases, and then some quite closed. And for me, I think it's the open-ended perspective, right, which a course like this should lead us to. That you're actually exploring whole other worlds, but you're also possibly finding real practices to do that exploration, right? Mm-hmm. partly these are intellectual practices, but if you're interested in contemplation and meditation, these can be actually more grounded, kind of embodied practices that are not just about history or thinking about ideas, but are actual ways of being in the world, or being in different worlds that we might find our ways into, or find our way into, sorry.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end than, opening ourselves up to existing in new worlds, becoming more aware of new worlds of experience and practice. So with that, thank you so much to Daniel Stewart, teacher of the upcoming Buddhist Studies Online 102, Buddhist Meditation in Theory and Practice, for speaking with us today. This was such a pleasure to hear more about your own formation in Buddhist studies, your research interests and methodological inclinations, as well as to get a bit of a preview of Buddhist Studies 102.
It's been a real delight. Thanks for having me again, Kate.